Imagine I told you that a billionaire could control a company worth billions without personally owning every part of it. The building might not be in their name. The shares might not be in their personal name. The investment portfolio might not be in their personal name. And yet, they can still sit at the top of the entire structure. This sounds like a loophole, but it's actually something much more ordinary and much more powerful. Ownership. Because when you have a few $1,000s, managing your money is simple. You have a bank account, maybe some stocks, maybe a house. But when your wealth reaches hundreds of millions or billions, your biggest problem isn't necessarily making money anymore. It's managing the machine you've already built. And that's when something fascinating happens. Money stops looking like money. It starts looking like companies. A company can own another company. That company can own subsidiaries. A family can have an investment office managing its assets. And underneath all of it can be businesses, real estate, stocks, and private investments. So today, we're going inside that machine. Not to claim that billionaires are secretly breaking the law, and not to tell you that every complicated ownership structure is suspicious. Instead, we're answering one much more interesting question. If a billionaire doesn't personally own everything, how do they still control an empire? And once you understand the answer, you'll never look at a billionaire's net worth the same way again. Let's start with something most people get wrong. When Forbes says someone is worth, say, $100 billion, that doesn't mean the person has $100 billion sitting in a bank account. A huge portion of billionaire wealth can come from ownership stakes in companies, and that's an important distinction. Imagine you own 20% of a company worth $100 billion. Your stake could theoretically be worth $20 billion, but you don't have $20 billion in cash. You have an asset that represents ownership. And now imagine that instead of owning that stake personally, a company you control owns it. Suddenly, the structure looks very different. Now we've moved from a bank account to an ownership architecture. And that word is important because billionaires aren't necessarily trying to hide their wealth. They're often trying to organize it. Here's one of the simplest pieces of the puzzle: a holding company. A holding company is essentially a company whose purpose can include owning stakes in other companies. It doesn't necessarily need to manufacture products. It doesn't need thousands of employees. Its value can come from what it owns. And this structure is not exclusive to billionaires. Some of the biggest corporations in the world use variations of it. Take Google. In 2015, Google reorganized under a new parent company called Alphabet. Google became a subsidiary of Alphabet. That meant different businesses could operate under a larger corporate structure. And suddenly, the organization chart told a much more interesting story than the Google logo ever could. The important lesson isn't that Alphabet is some secret billionaire structure. It isn't. The lesson is that control can be organized through layers of ownership. And once you understand that, the billionaire world becomes much easier to understand. But here's where you might be thinking, why bother? Why not simply put everything under your own name? The answer is that large-scale wealth creates problems that ordinary people rarely have to deal with. Imagine you're responsible for a public company, private investments, real estate, multiple businesses, international assets, estate planning, philanthropy, and eventually, your family's future. You could try to personally manage everything, or you could build an organization around it. And that's where the family office enters the story. Think of a family office as a private financial headquarters. The SEC describes family offices as entities used by wealthy families to manage their wealth and provide services that can include investment, tax, and estate planning. In simple terms, instead of one billionaire trying to personally keep track of everything, there can be a professional team: investment managers, accountants, lawyers, tax specialists, estate planners, and other professionals. The family office doesn't magically create wealth. Its job can be to help manage it, and that's a huge shift in perspective. Because when someone has billions, their wealth becomes less like a personal possession and more like an institution. Now we get to the most important part. ownership and control aren't always exactly the same thing. Imagine a giant company with millions of shares. One person doesn't necessarily need to own every share to have significant influence. Voting rights matter. Board positions matter. Share classes can matter. Corporate agreements matter. And legal definitions of beneficial ownership can matter too. So when you ask who owns the company, you might get one answer. But if you ask who controls the company, you could get a much more complicated answer. And this distinction is what makes billionaire wealth so fascinating. Because an empire doesn't have to be personally held to be controlled. Let's imagine a completely fictional billionaire. Call him Alex. Alex owns a major technology business. Instead of personally owning every asset connected to that business, imagine Alex sits above a structure. Then separately, Alex's family has an investment organization. That organization manages investments across different areas: public stocks, private companies, real estate, other investments. And suddenly, Alex's wealth isn't one giant pile. It's a network. And networks are powerful because every part can have a different function. One entity can own, another can operate, another can invest, another can manage, another can handle family affairs. The result? A single individual can sit at the center of an enormous economic structure. And here's where the story gets bigger, because the purpose isn't always about saving money. It can be about organization. Imagine owning 10 businesses. Would you personally run every payroll, every investment, every legal document, every property, every succession decision? Probably not. At a certain scale, you need systems, and that's exactly what corporations are built to do. A billionaire may therefore use the same basic principle that huge companies use. Separate the functions, separate ownership, separate operations, separate management, separate risk, and coordinate them from above. That's why the billionaire's greatest asset may not be a mansion, or a private jet, or even a giant bank balance. It may be the structure surrounding the wealth. But there's an even bigger problem. What happens when the billionaire dies? Because a business empire that depends entirely on one person isn't really an empire. It's a temporary fortune. This is why succession becomes so important. Think about some of the world's richest families. Their fortunes aren't necessarily built around one person's lifetime. They're built around businesses and assets that can continue across generations. The goal changes. At first, the goal might be make the first billion, then protect the billion, and eventually make sure the billion survives the billionaire. That's when wealth becomes something different. It becomes a legacy system. Consider a huge family-controlled company. The family might not personally run the company's factories. They might not manage every employee. They might not even be involved in everyday operations. But they can retain an important ownership position. That ownership can give the family influence over the direction of the business. And when the business grows, the family's economic position can grow with it. This is one reason the richest families can remain wealthy for generations. They're not necessarily rebuilding their fortune from zero every generation. They're inheriting the machine, the businesses, the ownership, the investments, the relationships, the institutions, the knowledge, and sometimes the voting power. Now, here's where we need to separate reality from internet mythology. Whenever people hear about holding companies, trusts, offshore entities, or family offices, the conversation often immediately becomes, they're hiding their money. But that's too simple. Some structures can absolutely be used for secrecy or aggressive tax planning, and laws vary dramatically between countries. But a holding company itself isn't automatically suspicious. A family office isn't automatically suspicious. A complex ownership structure isn't automatically illegal. These can have legitimate business and estate planning purposes. So the interesting question isn't, are billionaires hiding money? It's, why does extreme wealth require so much structure? And the answer is surprisingly simple: scale. Think about the difference. If you have $10,000, your financial life can fit inside a banking app. If you have $10 million, you may need accountants, investment professionals, and lawyers. But when we're talking about billions, the numbers become almost impossible to comprehend. A $1 billion fortune isn't simply a lot of money. It's a huge collection of assets, businesses, shares, property, investments, and obligations. At that scale, managing wealth becomes a business of its own. And that's why the billionaires' financial world can start looking like a corporation. So, who really owns a billionaire's empire? Sometimes the answer is surprisingly complicated. It might involve a holding company, subsidiaries, investment entities, a family office, trusts, boards, voting rights, and professional managers. But here's the biggest lesson. We usually think of wealth as something you have, but at extreme levels, wealth becomes something you organize. And that's the difference between having money and building an empire. Because an empire isn't powerful simply because one person owns everything. It's powerful because the system keeps working. The billionaire may be the face, but behind that face, there can be an entire architecture of ownership and control. And once you understand that architecture, you stop asking, how much money does this billionaire have? And you start asking something much more interesting. What does that billionaire actually control? Because sometimes the most important number isn't the billionaire's net worth. It's the number of things sitting underneath their name.